95% of Northern Ireland has that access. So it's the highest percentage in the country, and that's attributed to the work done between the central government and the Assembly.
Sir Lee.
Why should people living in rural areas be second-class citizens when it comes to mobile phone coverage?
Well, we agree. That's why we have the Shared Rural Network programme that is dealing with a lot of those not-spot problems.
Tim Johnson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Minister, the number of black students entering into STEM are leaving in great numbers. So can you say what you're doing to identify the challenges and what you're doing to help progression of black students in STEM?
Mr Speaker, the government is absolutely committed to expanding STEM opportunities. A key way of doing that is building mathematical capabilities, helping girls and minorities stick with maths. That's why the Prime Minister announced our ambition to see all young people receive maths education until aged 18.
Final question, Nigel Mills.
Amber Valley has a high incidence of respiratory disease, so what more can the government do to increase investment in research into respiratory conditions in the areas that need that research the most?
I'm clinging on to the
The Medical Research Council is benefiting from the highest ever level of research spend. I'd be very happy to meet with my honourable friend to talk about what more we can do in this important area.
We now come to Prime Minister's questions. Sir Lane Saxby.
Question 1, please, Mr Speaker.
Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, we are joined today in the gallery by postmasters caught up in the Horizon IT scandal. It is one of the greatest miscarriages of justice in our history, and that is why we've introduced a bill to quash convictions, delivered schemes to ensure swift compensation, and established an independent inquiry. Mr Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Sir Lane Saxby.
Mr Speaker, does my right honourable friend agree towns like Barnstaple, the main transport hub in North Devon serving hundreds of square miles, should have a fully functioning bus station, as Live Dem run North Devon Council has not reopened now since the pandemic, leaving residents out in the cold with no public facilities? As people start to feel the difference with tax cuts and falling inflation, does he agree we should be making it easier for people to use the bus, come to town and support Barnstable's local economy? And will my right honourable friend join me in calling on the Lib Dems to get on with reopening the bus station?
Well, Mr Speaker, we know how vital bus services are for communities right across the country. That's why we're providing Devon with £17 million to deliver better bus services, and we introduced the £2 fare bus cap. But I know my honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Transport, was recently visiting my honourable friend, seeing the benefits of reopening Barnstable bus station, and it's clear that the local Liberal Democrats should just get on and do it.
We now come to the Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Can I too welcome the postmasters in the gallery in their quest for justice? And Mr Speaker, this week we marked 35 years since the disaster at Hillsborough, and the enduring courage and determination of the families must be marked by the passing of a Hillsborough law. Mr Speaker, we also lost Lord Richard Rosser, a lifelong member of the Labour Party. He will be greatly missed, and our thoughts are with his wife Sheena, his family and friends. Mr Speaker, I'm privileged to be the proud owner of a copy of the former Prime Minister's new book. It's a rare, unsigned copy. It's the only unsigned copy. It's quite the read. She claims the Tory party's disastrous kamikaze budget that triggered chaos for millions was, her words, the happiest moment of her premiership. Has the Prime Minister met anyone with a mortgage who agrees?
Well, Mr Speaker, all I'd say is he ought to spend a bit less time reading that book and a bit more time reading the Deputy Leader's tax advice.
I think we'll have less talking. I want to get through PMQs. Keir Starmer.
Mr Speaker, Mr. Speaker, we've got a billionaire Prime Minister and a billionaire Prime Minister, both of whose families have used schemes to avoid millions of pounds of tax, smearing a working-class woman. And the Prime Minister, the former Prime Minister, has a long list of people to blame for the economic misery. They don't want to hear it. They made her Prime Minister, and millions of people are paying the price. She's got a long list of people to blame. She blames the Governor of the Bank of England, the Treasury, the Office for Budget Responsibility. The American President is blamed at one point. We even learned that the poor old lettuce was part of the deep state. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that it's actually much simpler than that? It was the Tories' unfunded tax cuts, tens of billions of pounds of unfunded tax cut, that crashed the economy and left millions paying more on their mortgages, wasn't it?
Mr. Speaker, everyone knows that 2 years ago I wasn't afraid to repeatedly warn about what her economic policies would lead to, even if it wasn't what people wanted to hear at the time. Mr. Speaker, I was right then, but I'm also right now when I say that his economic policies would be a disaster for Britain. He would send inflation up, mortgages up and taxes up, and working people would pay the price.
Well, I appreciate the Prime Minister having the stomach to say it out loud, but everyone knows it's the Tory party's obsession with wild, unfunded tax cut that crashed the economy. We know it, he knows it, they know it, and the whole country is living it. So when is he finally going to learn the lesson from his predecessor's mistakes and explain where the money is coming from for his own completely unfunded £46 billion promise to scrap national insurance?
Mr. Speaker, when my predecessor was running for leader, to use his words, I did have the stomach to argue out loud about her economic policies, had the conviction to say that they were wrong. But, not once, but twice, he tried to make his predecessor Prime Minister. Despite him opposing NATO and Trident, ignoring anti-Semitism and siding with our enemies. It's clear what he did. He put his own interests ahead of Britain's.
I think actually when he was running for Prime Minister, for leader, he was explaining how he's funneling money from poor areas to pay it into richer areas. We know what his record is. I notice he's not denying the £46 billion promise to scrap the national insurance, but is refusing to say where the money will come from. And we've been trying for months to get to the bottom of this. So now's his chance. No more spin, no more waffle, no more diversion. I know that'll be difficult. He can either, Mr. Speaker, this is the choice, he can either cut state pension or the NHS that national insurance funds, that's route one, or he can put up income tax. Which one is it?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we've just cut taxes by £900 for a typical worker. We've delivered the biggest tax cut for businesses since the 1980s. But while we're cutting taxes, Labour is already putting them up. In Wales, putting up taxes right now for small businesses. In Birmingham, putting up council tax by 21%. And in London, his mayor has put up taxes by 70%, Mr. Speaker. And this is just a glimpse of what they'd do if they got in power. A few weeks ago, he finally admitted it to The Sun. What would he say he would do? I quote, he said, "We would put up taxes." It's always the same, Mr. Speaker. Higher taxes and working people paying the price.
No single politician has ever put tax up more times than he has. But Mr. Speaker, just hang on, because he was given the chance. He was just given the chance to rule out cutting the NHS or state pensions to pay for scrapping this. No, I was a lawyer long enough to know when someone's avoiding the question. So I'm going to give him another chance. will he now rule out cuts to the NHS, cuts the state pension, or putting up taxes to pay for his unfunded £46 billion promise to scrap national insurance? Which is it?
Mr. Speaker, I make absolutely no apology about wanting to end the unfairness of the double taxation on work, Mr. Speaker. The NHS is receiving record funding under this Conservative government. Pensioners have just received a £900 increase under this government. But if he wants to talk about tax, let's have a look at what Labour's brand newly appointed tax advisor has to say. This advisor thinks that supporting pensioners is a complete disgrace, Mr. Speaker. He believes their free TV licences are ridiculous. And if it wasn't bad enough, this advisor has called for increases in income tax, in national insurance and VAT. It all makes sense now. That's who the Shadow Chancellor's been copying and pasting from.
So this is genuinely extraordinary. Two chances to rule out, Mr. Speaker, two chances to rule out cuts to state pension, cuts to the NHS, or income tax rises to fund his promise to abolish national insurance.
Order. Mr. Hull, I want you to set a good example, not a bad one. Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, this really matters. He's had two chances to rule out these cuts to NHS, cuts to tax or pensions or tax rises. This matters to millions of people watching who want to know what's going to happen to their NHS and pensions. It really does matter to millions of people who are watching. So I'll be really generous now and give him one last chance. Very simple, very clear. Is his £46 billion promise to abolish national insurance being paid for by cuts to the NHS, cuts to the state pension, or yet another Tory tax rise?
Mr. Speaker, he's really got to keep up, Mr. Speaker. Right? It's this government that's just delivered a £900 increase to the state pension. It's this government that's already committed to the triple lock for the next Parliament. He had 6 opportunities. I didn't think I heard him say that, Mr. Speaker. And when it comes to the NHS, you'd much rather be treated in Conservative-run NHS in England, not the Labour-run NHS in Wales, Mr. Speaker. But it's another week where all we heard is political sniping, Mr. Speaker, not a word about their plans for the country. He's failed to acknowledge that since we last met, taxes have been cut by £900, state pensions gone up, free childcare has been expanded, wages have risen for 9 months in a row, Mr. Speaker, and just today, inflation down again to 3.2%. Our plan is working and the Conservatives are delivering a brighter future for Britain.
Mr. Speaker, you will not be surprised to learn that I very much welcome the £20 million allocated to Carlton in my Gedling constituency as part of the long-term plan for towns. But I'm very eager to see that this money is spent according to local wishes. I know there will be consultations following the setting up of the Towns Board, so will my right honourable friend join me in urging Carlton residents to take part in those forthcoming consultations, to make sure their voices are heard and to ensure that this money is spent where the people want?
Can I thank my honourable friend for his tireless campaigning on behalf of the residents of Carlton. Our long-term plan for towns means that 75 towns across the country, including Carlton, will benefit from £20 million each to invest in their local area. But crucially, as he said, that will be in the hands of local people deciding on their priorities for the place that we live, whether it's regenerating local high streets, investing in parks and green spaces, or tackling antisocial behaviour. We're levelling up across the country, and he deserves enormous praise for his role in securing that investment.
SNP leader Stephen Flynn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This week, a former Prime Minister who oversaw a financial crash before being unceremoniously turfed from office told the public the truth, and I'm not referring to that one, Mr. Speaker, because on Monday, Gordon Brown told the people of these Isles that the forces pulling Britain apart are greater than the forces holding it together. So maybe the Prime Minister can find some time this afternoon to perhaps agree with just one of his predecessors.
Well, Mr. Speaker, Where I do agree with my predecessor very strongly is that Scotland would be far stronger inside the United Kingdom.
Stephen Flynn.
Mr Speaker, of course, where Gordon Brown was also correct was in stating that Scottish independence is not simply off the agenda. And indeed, those remarks were echoed just yesterday by the General Secretary of the Scottish Trade Union Congress, who stated that it remains an unresolved issue, Mr Speaker, before going on to state, and I confirm, and they may laugh at her, but she said, that can be a very dangerous place to end up in when you are not allowing people to express their wishes in a democratic manner. So may I ask the Prime Minister, does he welcome the fulsome, wholehearted and warm support of the Labour Party in denying the people of Scotland that opportunity to have a say over their own future?
Well, Mr Speaker, we did have a democratic vote on that topic, but what I would suggest to the SNP is that rather than obsessing about independence and indeed wasting time cracking down on free speech and trying to lock up J.K. Rowling, he should focus on what the people of Scotland actually care about: schools, hospitals, jobs and our new tax cuts.
Andrea Jenkins.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I abhor a two-tier policing system, and we must ensure that everyone's treated equally under the rule of law. The Labour Police and Crime Commissioner who investigated the Beergate scandal handed their police chief constable a new 3-year contract whilst the investigation into the Labour Party leader and deputy leader was ongoing. Now, 2 former Labour MPs are overseeing the force due to investigate the opposition deputy leader. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that complete transparency throughout this investigation is of the utmost importance?
Yeah, my right honourable friend makes an important point. A key principle of our country is that there are the same rules for everyone. And when it comes to this topic, I do think the Labour leader should show some leadership. To avoid stop reading the legal advice, simply just publish it and get a grip of the situation. And it says a lot about his priorities, that when it comes to his famed legal expertise, he's more than happy to help defend Hizbut Tahrir, but refuses to help his own deputy leader.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The recently published Canova report makes it absolutely clear that the IRA was riddled with British agents from top to bottom. Those agents were involved in abduction, torture and murder of British and Irish citizens. The British government, successive British governments, knew all about it and did nothing. The report also calls for an apology from the government to those victims. Will the Prime Minister take this opportunity now to make that apology?
Well, Mr Speaker, as the honourable gentleman will know, this is an interim report. As the Secretary of State has laid out, we can't comment on the findings until we get the final report, but we would never condone wrongdoing where there is evidence of this. But I will say this also, because it's not said enough. The overwhelming majority of the police, armed forces and intelligence services served with great distinction. They defended democracy in the face of some horrendous violence, and without their service and their sacrifice, there would have been no peace process. They helped ensure that the future of Northern Ireland will never be decided by violence, but by the consent of its people.
Sir Simon Clark.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Does my right honourable friend agree with me? We don't agree on everything, but we do agree on this, that if anyone wants to see why this government has introduced strong mayors, they need only look to Ben Houchen in the Tees Valley. Because from saving our airport to introducing our free port to bringing steel-making back, Ben delivers. And does my right honourable friend agree with me that the best thing that Ben has done is do this without charging any mayoral tax, which his Labour opponent would need to do to fund his unfunded spending plans?
Well, my right honourable friend is absolutely right to raise the great work of Ben Houchen, and I share his concerns about the pledges of the Labour candidate. Over £130 million of unfunded spending, showing that Labour can't be trusted. And we all see the results of this, Mr Speaker, in Labour-run Birmingham. Taxes going up by 20%. And that is the story of what Labour in local government means. Working people paying the price, and it's exactly why he and I completely agree on this. The people of Teesside should vote Ben Houchen and vote Conservative.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Last year in Shropshire, 10,000 people waited for more than 24 hours in A&E. That's 10,000 people over 65 waiting on hard plastic chairs or in trolleys in our accident and emergency department. The Prime Minister tells us he's got a plan for the NHS, but what people in North Shropshire want to know is how long they are going to have to wait for him to get on and fix the issues where we are.
Well, Mr. Speaker, with the record funding that we're putting into the NHS, our urgent emergency care plan is delivering more ambulances, more beds, but also faster discharge through our hospitals to speed the flow, and that plan is working. Of course, there's more to do, but this winter we saw ambulance and A&E waiting times improve from the year before for the first time in many years, and if we stick to the plan, we'll continue to deliver improvement for her constituents and everyone else.
Gareth Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in 2010, somebody earning £15,000 a year paid £1,700 in income tax. Today, somebody earning £15,000 a year pays less than £500 of tax. So does the Prime Minister agree with me that this has helped create jobs, growth and self-reliance?
My honourable friend is quite right, and because of our plan, the economy, after a tough few years, has indeed turned the corner. Inflation has fallen from over 11% to 3.2%. It's forecast to return back to target in just a few months, a year ahead of expectations. And that's why, Mr. Speaker, we've been able to cut people's taxes, a tax cut, as he mentioned, worth £900 for an average worker, which, by the way, is part of our plan to end the long-term unfairness of the double taxation on work.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 4 years ago, my constituent Juliana was drugged and raped by her then boyfriend. After his conviction, Juliana was advised that reading a transcript of his trial would help her to come to terms with her experience. But when she requested that transcript, she was told that she would have to pay more than £7,000. Astonishingly, Juliana is not alone. I have heard about victims who've been quoted fees of up to £22,000 just to read trial transcripts that are part of their own story. Mr. Speaker, justice should not have a price tag. The Liberal Democrats' amendment to the Victims' Bill would give all victims the right to read sentencing remarks and summings up free of charge. Juliana is here in the gallery today, and she asks if the Prime Minister will support that amendment. Will he look her in the eye and say yes?
Mr. Speaker, I'm extremely sorry to hear about Juliana's case, and my sympathies with her and indeed her family. We are committed to improving victims' access to court transcripts to help them move on and rebuild their lives. We already offer a free service to families of homicide victims, for example, and that's why we have already committed to a one-year pilot to help identify the current demand, inform our next steps, and alongside this, we're actively looking at other options to immediately reduce the costs.
James Sunderland.
Mr. Speaker, Bracknell Forest Council has a particular challenge with special educational needs, and I'm keen to support them. I am grateful to the Government for the recent SEND review, the significant increase in resources and the bespoke safety valve programme for Bracknell, but additional school places are needed now. Could the Prime Minister please agree today to release the funding for our new SEND units at Sandhurst and Edgebarrow schools and commit to fully funding up front our new SEND school in Crowthorne?
Can I thank my honourable friend for highlighting how Bracknell Forest's local authority has worked positively with the department through the safety valve programme, and as part of that agreement over the next few years the council will receive £16 million in extra funding to provide the vital education that my honourable friend's constituents deserve. I'm told that the department is still reviewing capital bids for the safety valve programme, but they will be in touch with local authorities directly as soon as possible.
Daniel Zagler.
In the exchanges earlier, we didn't hear much of a defence from the Prime Minister of his predecessor, so perhaps he could tell the House, what does he consider to be her greatest achievement?
Well, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, while the party opposite were busy trying to take us back into the EU and reverse the referendum result, my predecessor was signing trade deals around the world, which have now meant, Mr. Speaker, that Brexit Britain has overtaken the Netherlands, France and Japan to become the fourth largest exporter in the world.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituent, Claire Massey, and one of her two children almost lost their lives in a fire at her home in February 2023. Since then, Claire has been a victim of bullying by aggressive claims handlers and negligent and unprofessional conduct, including violating a policy and withdrawing alternative accommodation by the insurer, Policy Expert, part of the accredited Insurance Europe Group and Limited Trinity Claims Management. Claire has raised institutional failings with the Financial Conduct Authority, which appears toothless. She's also successfully raised individual issues with the Financial Ombudsman, but the delaying tactics of the insurance means she is no closer to a resolution. Claire is here in the gallery today and is asking, will the Prime Minister meet with her and me to look at how we can better protect consumers against bad practices in the insurance industry? And does he agree with me that it is time to establish an Office of the Whistleblower?
My honourable friend is an excellent campaigner on behalf of her constituent, and can I extend my sympathies to Claire and her family. Whilst I can't comment on individual cases, I'm sure she'll understand, I know that the Financial Conduct Authority does have the powers that it needs to take action against firms that breach its rules, and further customers can contact the Financial Ombudsman Service, whose decisions are binding on insurers. But I will immediately ensure that the relevant minister meets with my honourable friend to look more closely at the specific issue and the case that she raises.
Ukrainian Member of Parliament Mykola Stefanchuk is in the public gallery this afternoon. I'm sure we all wish to welcome him and wish Ukraine, Slava Ukraine. Mykola has told me that Ukraine has the people, Ukraine has the courage, but Ukraine does not currently have the weapons and the air defence to secure her freedom. In light of today's Russian attack on Chernihiv this morning, which has killed at least 10 and injured many more, can I ask the Prime Minister, will he respond to President Zelensky's statement that this would not have happened if Ukraine had received sufficient air defence equipment?
Mr. Speaker, it was a pleasure to address members of the Ukrainian Parliament when I visited Ukraine earlier this year. Indeed, it was my first foreign visit of the year. I was the first foreign leader to visit Ukraine and President Zelensky to demonstrate our strong support for the Ukrainian people at their moment of struggle against Russian aggression. We've increased the amount of support that we've given to Ukraine this year, indeed the first major country to do so, and a big part of that support concerns air defence, where we have led in supporting Ukraine's efforts. We'll continue to do so, and also continue to encourage other countries around the world to step up and match our leadership, because we all want to see a future for Ukraine based on freedom from tyranny.
Mr. Speaker, on a recent visit to Pimlico in my constituency, the Prime Minister heard directly from local people concerned about the eye-watering rise in violent crime and robberies. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that the London Labour Mayor has failed to take advantage of extra government funding to recruit more police, and that on the 2nd of May, Londoners can send him a very clear message: he's let them down?
Mr. Speaker, Sadiq Khan is failing London. While burglary is down across England, it's up in London. Violent crime down across England, but up in London. And the Labour Mayor is the only one of 43 police and crime commissioners to have missed his police recruitment target. Londoners will have a chance, Mr. Speaker, to cast their vote on the 2nd of May, and I hope that they kick him out, because we all know they'll be safer with Susan Hall.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My local community is reeling from the discovery of 35 bodies and unidentifiable cremated ashes at a local funeral home. Their pain has been made worse when they realise the funeral plans they'd used their life savings for were fake. Does the Prime Minister agree that in these unique and limited circumstances, banks should offer discretion when deciding if chargeback applies to payment refunds?
Can I express my sympathies to the families affected by the case that the Honourable Lady raises? I believe that Ministry of Justice are urgently looking at the matter that she's raised. I'll ensure that someone gets in touch with her as soon as possible.
Derek Thomas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Robotic surgery allows laparoscopic surgery to be performed with increased precision, flexibility and control. This can result in reduced patient complication rates, reduced length of stay in hospital, and reduced hospital readmissions. However, there is currently no robotic surgery provision in Cornwall. As a result, residents of Cornwall have to travel to Devon for robotic procedures, a journey of more than 80 miles, 120 miles if you're from Elderslie, for West Cornwall and Elderslie residents. Will my friend the PM the Prime Minister commit to ring-fence capital funding for Cornwall to establish a robotic surgery service and address the health inequalities our constituents have lived with for far too long?
Can I thank my honourable friend for highlighting the potential of this innovative technology for patient care. I'm delighted to see that more generally Cornwall is benefiting from our new hospital programme, providing a new women's and children's hospital in the centre of Royal Cornwall, which he and I discussed when I was last with him. But I can also tell him that NHS England are actively exploring opportunities to expand robotic-assisted surgery. Any decisions on funding new allocations will factor in health inequalities, such as areas with less access to robots today, and I will ensure that the current access to robotic surgery in my honourable friend's local community is appropriately considered by the relevant Health Minister.
George Galloway.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister told us on Monday that he was off to make a telephone call to Mr. Netanyahu to urge restraint on a government that has killed and maimed well over 100,000 people in 6 months, 72% of them women and children. Can he tell us how the telephone call went and what he will do if his advice is not taken and an unrestrained war begins?
Mr. Speaker, I was pleased to speak with Prime Minister Netanyahu, who thanked the UK for their support of Israel's security over the weekend. We also discussed the situation and how Iran is isolated on the world stage, and also I made the point to him that significant escalation is not in anyone's interest, and it's a time for calm heads to prevail. I also reiterated our concerns about the humanitarian situation in Gaza, where I welcome the statements and commitments that the Israeli government have made about significantly increasing aid into Gaza, and now we need to see those commitments delivered.
Nigel Bills.
Thank you. The residents in Smalley and Denby are now faced by two huge solar farm applications with only a 500-metre gap between them. And both sites are wholly in the Greenbelt. So would the Prime Minister agree we should change planning guidance to make it absolutely clear that productive farms in the Greenbelt are not the right place for solar farms, and the investment and the time being spent should go on sites that might be appropriate, like car parks or brownfield land or roofs of industrial buildings, rather than wasting people's time and causing fear like this?
Well, Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is right that particularly at a time of increased geopolitical risk, we must protect our nation's food security and therefore our most valuable agricultural land. We do want to see more solar, which is one of the cheapest forms of energy, but, as he said, on brownfield sites, rooftops, and away from our best agricultural land. And that's why our recently published National Infrastructure Planning Rules set out the requirement for solar not to be placed on what is described as best and most valuable versatile land where possible. The Energy and Environment Secretaries are ensuring that developers and planning authorities strike the right balance so that we can deliver what he wants, which is more British food grown here at home.
Catherine McKinnell.
Out recently with Chris McEwen, the mayoral candidate in Teesside, it was clear that residents are really worried about crime. Levels in Tory-run Teesside are some of the highest in the country. Residential burglary rate is 52% higher than anywhere else in the country. When will the Prime Minister realise that he's not only lost control of his party, but of crime in this country too?
Mr. Speaker, what a joke! Right? But we've got police and crime commissioner elections across the country, and the honourable lady really should look at the record. Under this government, crime has been cut by 50%. 20,000 more police officers. But here are the facts, and this is why it's so extraordinary to hear what she said. People with a Labour police and crime commissioner are more likely to be victims of burglary and twice as likely to be victims of robbery. The facts completely speak for themselves. Vote Conservatives for safer streets.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Every month, my constituency, the Labour-run Warrington Council, spend nearly £4.5 million on interest payments to cover their £1.8 billion debt. Borrowing they've used to spend on an energy company that went bust, offices in Birmingham and Manchester, and even a business park that they purchased through an offshore company, presumably to avoid paying tax. Does the Prime Minister agree with me, it's time to send in the inspectors. Warrington Council has gone too far in its money-making schemes, and local councils should focus on delivering great services, and the way to achieve that is vote Conservative on the 2nd of May.
Well, Mr. Speaker, this year the government announced a further £600 million in extra funding for local councils, a real terms increase as it has done every single year of this Parliament. But we all know what happens when Labour are in charge, whether it is racking up debt in Warrington, as my honourable friend said, the 21% council tax increase in Labour-run Birmingham, or indeed slashing services in Nottingham, or, as I just said, higher crime on average in each Labour Police and Crime Commissioner area. It's crystal clear, Mr. Speaker, that whenever Labour are in charge, it's working people that pay the price.
Mr. Speaker, while 64,000 people are on the waiting list for a council house in the West Midlands, families are living in hotels, in cold and damp homes and mouldy flats. The Mayor of the West Midlands, Andy Street, has built 46 social homes in 8 years. Does the Prime Minister think that is good enough?
Yes. Mr. Speaker, Andy Street is absolutely delivering for the West Midlands. Unlike the Labour Mayor in London, he's delivered on all his housing targets, in fact. But it's the Labour-run council in Birmingham that's imposing on her constituents and others a 21% council tax rise. And what are they getting in exchange for that? 600 job losses, cuts to services, and on some streets, they're even turning off the lights, Mr. Speaker. I tell you, what Labour have done to Birmingham, the Conservatives will never let them do to Britain.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, can I just ask the Prime Minister to thank his right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Transport, for further meetings with Hitachi this morning, indeed with the union representatives. We're all glad to see what's happened with Alstom yesterday, but it's important that we do the same to support the factories up at Hitachi in Aycliffe.
Well, Mr. Speaker, can I thank my honourable friend for his role in championing the rail industry in the UK. As he rightly said, the Department for Transport and the Secretary of State have been actively engaged with companies to ensure we have a robust supply chain. And as he knows, we're investing record amounts in rail investment, particularly in the north, and we're pleased to see that that's being delivered.
Question, Nazshah.
Speaker, the Prime Minister is no doubt aware of the collapse of SSV law, and many constituents, including hundreds in my constituency, have been affected and have bills of hundreds, up to hundreds of thousands. One constituent had to sell his wedding gifts, and his father had a heart attack with the stress. People are having to pay, literally raid their pension pots and getting bills and bailiffs knocking on the door. Will the Prime Minister meet with me and my constituents, representatives of the collapse of SSB law, and make sure the government responds to something that is an injustice that's happened to people across the country?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm sorry to hear about the situation impacting the Honourable Lady's constituents. I'll be more than happy to make sure the right Minister looks into it and we get back to her as soon as possible.
That completes Prime Minister's questions. Right, please. The chamber's now cleared. We now come to the urgent question. Shadow Secretary of State, David Lammy for...
Mr. Speaker, I ask an urgent question to ask the Secretary of State if he will make a statement on the humanitarian situation in Gaza.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Deputy Foreign Secretary is regrettably unable to respond to this question in person, as he is in the World Bank Spring meetings in Washington. I will respond on his behalf. Earlier this month, we passed a grim milestone, 6 months since Hamas's horrific terrorist attack on Israel. The UK government has been working with partners across the region to secure the release of hostages, including British nationals. We want to see the release of all hostages. Palestinian civilians have spent these months suffering, with conditions worsening by the day. The humanitarian situation in Gaza is dire. The Iran attack and our support for Israel have not changed our focus on ensuring Israel meets its commitments to enable at least 500 aid trucks a day to enter Gaza. to open Ashdod port for aid deliveries, expand the Jordan land corridor, open a crossing into northern Gaza, and extending hours at Kerem Shalom and at Nitzana. We're pushing as hard as we can to get aid to Palestinian civilians, and as this House knows, we've been urging Israel at the highest levels to take immediate action on the bottlenecks holding up humanitarian relief. We have recently seen a small increase in the number of aid trucks being allowed to enter Gaza, but not all of them are full, and numbers are not yet close to reaching the levels required, given the severity of the humanitarian situation we now see. We will continue to press Israel to take immediate action to open Ashdod fully for humanitarian aid. Meanwhile, we recently announced new support for a life-saving aid corridor by sea to Gaza, including the deployment of a Royal Navy ship, which has now arrived in the Mediterranean and is ready to integrate with the US pier and provide a command and control platform. We're also committing up to $9.7 million for aid deliveries through this corridor, as well as providing logistical expertise and equipment. In recent weeks, the Royal Air Force has conducted 7 airdrops along the Gazan coast, delivering more than 58 tonnes of food. And UK Med's field hospital, funded by the UK, is up and running in Gaza. It's treated more than 8,000 people already, a high proportion of them children. We need to see the operating environment within Gaza improve, so that as more aid gets in, it can be distributed quickly, safely and effectively. Israel must ensure the UN has the access, equipment and staff it needs to do this. We were horrified by the attack on the World Central Kitchen convoy, which killed 7 aid workers, including 3 very dedicated British nationals. Israel must do more to protect aid workers, including guaranteed deconfliction for aid convoys and other humanitarian work to ensure they can operate safely. The findings of Israel's investigation must be published in full and followed up with a wholly independent review to ensure the utmost transparency and accountability. 6 months on, Mr. Speaker, however much we might wish otherwise, the fighting has not yet come to an end. We cannot and will not stand by. The Foreign Secretary is in the region this week, pressing for further action.
Shadow Foreign Secretary David Lammy.
Well, Mr. Speaker, thank you for granting me this urgent question. Conditions in Gaza are desperate and intolerable. Famine is taking hold. There is sewage pooling in the streets. The water has still not been switched back on. Almost nothing is reaching northern Gaza, where people are already dying of starvation. The healthcare system has been utterly devastated. Yesterday, leading NGOs told me about specific blocks and restrictions they face from Israeli authorities in doing their life-saving work. Aid sat waiting, unable to reach those in need, some rotting where they stood. Items removed from trucks without explanation. Doctors are reusing single-use medical equipment from patients who have died. The UN report today said 10,000 women have been killed. Mr. Speaker, this is a description of hell on earth, and it cannot go on. For months, we've demanded that aid flow without restrictions, unfettered, unimpeded, at a level to meet humanitarian need. The UN Security Council has demanded it. The ICJ has ordered it. But despite the pledges made, UN figures show that there was more aid going in some days in January than there was yesterday. So I have 3 questions for the government. First, can the Minister be clear that Israel is not meeting its commitments, and what pressure is the government applying to change that? Second, why has the government not yet announced it's restoring funding to UNRWA? It's shocking that in the face of famine, the UK is one of the last major donors that has not yet resumed funding without explanation. Third, why is the government seemingly softening its message to Netanyahu on Rafah? Let us be clear, 1.5 million Palestinians sheltering there have nowhere safe to go. Mr. Speaker, there can't be a humanitarian operation to meet the scale of need without an immediate ceasefire now. Both sides must agree to comply, and we note that it is Hamas and their leader Sinwar which rejected the latest ceasefire deal. They must urgently agree to end this war now, to prevent the further loss of innocent life, to free the hostages still cruelly held by Hamas, to allow a surge of aid into Gaza.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Important points have been made, and I think it's important to welcome that Israel's commitments to increase the amount of aid getting into Gaza and the limited steps that have been made. But, this is important, but more must be done, as the Right Honourable Gentleman was saying, to realise these commitments. And we continue to urge this. As I said, the Foreign Secretary is in the region. We're working hard on these issues. The Right Honourable Gentleman also talked about UNRWA. The final report from Kelowna is due at the end of April. We'll review that and then make a decision on the future funding. We do recognise the important role that UNRWA plays. And on the wider point, the more strategic point as well, in terms of our approach, it's very clear we want to see humanitarian pause and then push for the conditions for a sustainable ceasefire.
Sir Oliver Hill.
Right honourable friend, agree with me that the position of the hostages is absolutely key to this. And is he able to report any more progress? I mean, he's explained that Hamas have not agreed to the latest situation. But doesn't he agree with me that pressure needs to be put on them by their interlocutors who are working with them to really do something solid on the hostage problem and do it speedily?
The government continues to call for an immediate humanitarian pause, as we said, to allow for the release of hostages. While we cannot provide a running commentary on negotiations, which are highly sensitive and ongoing, the UK is using all of our diplomatic channels to support international negotiation efforts being facilitated by Egypt, Qatar and the US.
We come to SNP spokesperson Brendan O'Hara.
Mr. Speaker, understandably, perhaps the world's attention has been on the shocking Iranian missile attack at the weekend, but we cannot and we must not forget about the humanitarian crisis in Gaza and the plight of millions of innocent civilians facing a man-made famine and living with the constant threat of attack. Neither can we forget those immensely brave humanitarian aid workers, particularly the 7 World Central Kitchen employees whose status as humanitarians appears to have offered them little or no protection from the IDF. And despite the promises made, the United Nations has reported that this week more than 40% of what they tried to take into Gaza was rejected. And those of us who have been to the border and have seen the efforts of the Egyptian Red Crescent and their warehouse full of rejected medical equipment have a pretty good idea what those items were. And this is an area which has no single operational hospital. But the elephant in the room is arms export licences. And for how much longer is the UK going to send humanitarian aid to Gaza while simultaneously licensing weapons sales to Israel? And wouldn't the best form of humanitarian aid for the people of Gaza be to end supplying Israel with the weapons that will kill them?
The Honourable Gentleman is right to highlight what happened in Iran recently, and of course we mustn't forget the humanitarian situation on the ground in Gaza. We're working very hard to make sure that aid can come through that he talked about. I highlighted that in my opening remarks. He also talked about exports. The latest assessment carried out by the Foreign Secretary leaves our position on export licences unchanged. This is consistent with the advice ministers have received, and will continue to keep this position under review. But he should remember his opening point about Iran and what's happened recently, and I'll leave it there on export controls.
Humanitarian aid getting into the Gaza Strip is very important. And has my right honourable friend noticed in that regard that the White House National Security spokesman said in an interview with NBC in the last couple of days that aid getting into Gaza has increased by a large amount in the last few days. More than 2,000 trucks have been able to get in, about 100 trucks in the last 24 hours alone. 3 bakeries have reopened in northern Gaza in the past week, producing some 3 million pita breads daily, and food aid convoys are now continuing via the newly opened northern crossing. There's always more to do, of course, and as I said, it's very important. but will he accept that there are significant improvements, considering this is still an active war zone?
I'm grateful for the comments from my right honourable friend. As I said in my response to the opposition previously, sorry, can you just remember the question again? Sorry, on...
Just about aid is improving.
Excuse me. Sorry. So we've seen a limited improvement. He says it's been significant, it has, but from a low base. And clearly our aspirations are a lot higher, as I set out before. There are a number of key areas we want to see further improvements. We're working closely with Israel on that. Excuse me.
Select Committee Chair, Sarah Champion.
Minister, airdrops, promises of harbours, promises of money to come. These are not even touching the sides of the scale of the problem. People are starving to death. Yes. At the beginning of March, my committee published a report for the UK government to press for more than 500 trucks of humanitarian aid a day to be allowed into Gaza, for all of the crossings to open, for the Israeli military to cooperate better with aid agencies to deconfliction, so that humanitarian workers can live but also safely carry out their vital work. And despite the Foreign Secretary's optimism of greater humanitarian flows, the weekly average is just over 1,100 trucks a week. Why is this government not doing more to persuade Israel to meet its responsibilities under international law and facilitate the aid to the people to Gaza? How many more people have to die?
Minister.
I understand the honourable member's concerns, particularly in her position as chair of the Select Committee, but I have highlighted already that we are pressing incredibly hard with Israel. We are pressing incredibly hard with Israel to make further progress. There has been limited progress, but the Foreign Secretary is in the region and he continues to press for these cases, as does my right honourable friend, the Minister for Development, who's doing important work in this area as well.
Maltese.
Mr. Speaker, I'm sorry to question the Minister again on the same theme, but he will start to appreciate the frustration in the House that over the last 6 months we've heard the government beg, plead, press, have telephone calls, meetings, have conversations, even the RAF in the sky to rightly defend Israel from Iran. And yet it's occurring to many of us that the Israeli government cares little for what we say. To the extent that Medical Aid for Palestinians now report that a famine is all but inevitable over the next few weeks in Gaza. When are we going to realise that saying things is making no difference and we actually have to act, not least to take steps to enforce the judgment of the International Court of Justice? When will we actually do something concrete to save these lives?
Minister.
As I said, we are pressing incredibly hard to make sure that we see further progress in this vital area. And as I highlighted before, one of the key things that we're doing is committing 9.7 million for aid deliveries through the life-saving aid corridor by sea to Gaza. This is a material step. This is action that's being taken. But clearly, we will continue to put pressure on the Israelis. They've made commitments. We want them to stand up and realise, or allow agencies to realise those commitments.
Julie Elliott.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Crossings are still not open. Trucks are going in half empty. 41% of requests from the UN to send in aid to northern Gaza are being refused by the Israeli government. That's the reality on the ground. The Colonna report comes out this Saturday, the 20th of April, not the end of the month. When will the government come to this House to tell us when it will reinstate funding to UNRWA, the only aid organisation with the infrastructure on the ground to deliver aid at scale?
As I said, we will be reviewing that report, and when we've received it, we'll make our final decision. We'll come and explain to Parliament what that decision is. And as I also highlighted, and more importantly, as the Development Minister has highlighted, we recognise the vital role that UNRWA plays.
Manchester.
Speaker, the Foreign Secretary was very proud to announce that the United Kingdom has set up a contact group for the Middle East, which has members from Europe, it has from the Middle East and the United States. A key part of that link to the humanitarian situation in Palestine and Gaza is this. The European Commission and some of those members, all those members, have decided to fund UNRWA. They have. And they're part of the contact group to find a solution to the Middle East. And therefore, why is it taking us so long when our European counterparts have made that decision? And linked to that, I asked the Minister to ask the Foreign Secretary, I raised it with him and the Prime Minister, to set up an international donors conference for Palestine. We did it with Friends of Syria. We now need to urgently move forward and show our leadership in this matter, as the situation is getting very, very, very critical.
Minister.
As I said, I'll say it again, we wait for the final colonial report before we make the decision on UNRWA. The situation around this was particularly concerning, so we need that report to make the decision. And my honourable friend will remember that we have also trebled the amount of aid that we provided to occupied Palestinian territories, and now our task is to make sure that we can and find ways to get that aid in.
Yesterday, Oxford doctors Nick Maynard and Deborah Harrington briefed parliamentarians very movingly about their experiences of treating people in Gaza. They impressed on us how important it was that they were kept safe, how many of their colleagues had died, and I'm sure the Minister and the whole House will thank them for their tireless work, and other aid workers and anyone who gives over their safety to save others. They also pointed out that the malnutrition that we are seeing now is making patients more vulnerable to infectious disease. And there is a report released by the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine that has projected that if it continues as it is, 74,000 excess deaths, that's beyond those who have died by bombs, will die if something isn't done. So will the Minister agree with me that the only thing that needs to happen now is that immediate bilateral ceasefire, but also a rebuilding of the medical situation in Gaza now, not later, because that is what's stopping people from getting the life-saving treatment they desperately need.
Minister.
I join her in praising the vital work of aid workers in the most challenging of circumstances and highlight the courage and bravery that they demonstrate. And obviously we want to make sure that we create the conditions in which they can operate more safely. She calls for a ceasefire. We call for a pause that can lead to a sustainable ceasefire, which will enable that to happen. And of course, as we move to that situation, then some of the issues she talked about, particularly around providing that extra medical support, can be provided.
Thanks
very much, Mr. Speaker. Access to the north of Gaza for humanitarian aid is still dire. 28 children reported to have died of malnutrition and dehydration. UNRWA continues to be disproportionately affected by access restrictions and was last able to deliver food to northern Gaza at the end of January. Other countries, as we've heard, are restoring funding to UNRWA, including the United States. So why are we taking so long?
Minister.
We want to see the report and we'll make our final decision. We recognise the important role of UNRWA. We also recognise the importance of opening a crossing in northern Gaza, which she highlighted in her opening point, and we are pressing Israel to make sure that they stand up to their commitments.
Richard Bergen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, I attended a meeting of British doctors who've recently been in Gaza, and they described the systematic targeting of healthcare in Gaza. Let's be clear, that is a war crime. A UN Special Rapporteur recently warned a meeting of MPs organised that government ministers and officials involved in arms exports to Israel should be absolutely clear that they could be individually criminally liable for aiding and abetting war crimes in Gaza. So will the Minister say, on the record, in this House and ahead of next week's High Court hearing, that the legal advice the government has received has confirmed that there is no such risk and that arms sales are in line with international law?
Minister.
These assessments we've made on our position on export licences remain unchanged, and this is consistent with the advice that ministers have received. We'll continue to keep this position under review.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As was referenced earlier, our close allies in the United States have commended Israel for stepping up the amount of aid getting into Gaza. Yet once those aid trucks are on the Gazan side of the border, Hamas has sought to hijack the trucks and seek to cynically use the distribution of aid as a political weapon, as recognised by this government. So, can I ask my right honourable friend what assessment he has made of the level of control exercised by Hamas on UNRWA and the distribution of aid?
He makes important points, and that's why we're waiting for this final report, as I've said repeatedly, so we can make a final decision. The underlying situation relating to UNRWA was very, very challenging, and we need to make sure this aid is used for the appropriate purposes. He makes a very important point.
Absolutely.
The government rightly condemned Iran for risking destabilization in the region and demonstrating intent on sowing chaos in its own backyard. Yet we have had 6 months of Israel killing civilians, doctors and aid workers, destroying almost all civilian infrastructure in Gaza, cutting off water, fuel and electricity, and severely limiting the supply of aid. This is all in clear violation of international law, has destabilized the region and sown chaos in Israel's own backyard. So will the Minister condemn the action of Israel then too?
Minister.
Look, we recognise that Israel has the right to defend itself, and we're calling for an immediate pause to get aid in and get the hostages out, as we said. We also recognise the destabilising action of Iran and its acolytes, and we have to make sure we push back and seek to de-escalate the whole situation.
Blackman.
Speaker, by now there could be a humanitarian pause. Aid could be flowing into Gaza to help those poor individuals who are threatened with famine and the war. But of course, just as the last humanitarian pause was breached by Hamas, Hamas refused to accept having a ceasefire on the terms that have been agreed. That could mean that the hostages could be coming back now. That could mean that the people of Gaza could be receiving the aid. Does he agree with me that Hamas are clearly the obstacle to peace in the Middle East?
Minister.
Clearly, Hamas are an obstacle to peace. Their actions provoked terrible atrocities in Israel back in October, and we find that abhorrent. We do now, though, want to make sure that we can find a way of tackling these terrible humanitarian situations, as I've described, and find a way to to tackling destabilising activity, further destabilising activity by Iran.
Paul Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Replying to my written question on the 15th of April, the Minister said, "We want UNRWA to give detailed undertakings about changes in personnel, policy and precedents." Has the Minister or any of his other colleagues actively sought these undertakings and changes from UNRWA by contacting them directly? And if so, on what date was that request last made?
Minister.
The broader issue about UNRWA, obviously, is we're waiting for this final report, and then we can make decisions on the detailed points he's made. I'll raise them with the Development Minister and get back to him.
Nigel Mills.
On the UNRWA funding issue again, would the Minister confirm that it is inconceivable that the money we would earmark for them will not be given this year? So could he either set out what alternative agencies he think on the ground could do the same work and achieve the same outcomes, or would he just confirm we're going to have to give them the money anyway, so we may as well get on with it?
Minister.
Look, I've already said that UNRWA do and carry out important work and have a vital role, but the situation, the concerns around their activities mean that we have to have this report, and we want to then look at our approach and our funding in relation to it.
Rachel Hopkins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Oxfam has reported that 1.1 million people are projected to be facing catastrophic levels of food insecurity in Gaza, and children are now starving. Samantha Power, Administrator of the USAID, told US Congress last week that northern Gaza is now experiencing famine. Does the government share that assessment, and how will aid get there?
Minister.
We continue to be very concerned about the humanitarian challenges that are in place in Gaza. And as I've highlighted to the House, we are pressing really hard. We're taking steps ourselves. We've increased the amount of aid that we're committing to the region. And we're focusing laser-like to seek Israel to step up to the commitments they've made. They've already made some limited progress. We need to see more.
Jameson.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. Israel's right to self-defence comes with clear responsibility. Gaza has become a conflict hellhole, and the delivery of more humanitarian aid from the international community, including the UN, is non-discretionary. But could the Minister please confirm to the House that everything possible is being done with the Israeli government to ensure that non-combatants are being supported and are not being inadvertently targeted or hit?
We've highlighted this with the Israeli government, and I can confirm to my honourable friend that we are pushing incredibly hard. Not only are we increasing the amount of aid that we've given to the region, highlighted to the region, but we want to make sure that that gets through as well. And we've already deployed a number of airdrops which have helped, but there's a lot more that needs to be done.
Imran Hussain.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As has been said, over 33,000 killed, 70% of whom are women and children. The ICJ has warned of a genocide, and more than 1 million are left starving, while almost 2 million are displaced from their homes. Yet, even as the Foreign Office's own legal advice, which they continually refuse to make public, is purported to declare that the Israeli military are breaking international law, and the UN Security Council pass a resolution calling for an immediate ceasefire, the reality remains nothing has changed. The bombs are still falling, the children are still starving, and the civilians are still dying. So let me ask the Minister a very simple question. Does international humanitarian law even mean anything anymore when the UK and international community continue to refuse to draw a line?
I understand the passion, I understand his concern about the area, but we continue to have grave concerns about the humanitarian access as well. But this is not sufficient to undermine our judgment that Israel is committed to complying with IHL in general.
Israel's military is reported to be using lavender, an artificial intelligence system, to help choose its bombing targets in Gaza. This is machine decision-making over human decision-making and arguably sacrifices accuracy in favour of speed. The lavender system identifies targets which are only reviewed for 20 seconds before authorisation of a strike. What discussions has the Minister had with MOD colleagues about the use of AI in combat, the concerns over error rates and the humanitarian impact on the ground?
Minister.
Too many civilians have been killed, and we want to see Israel take greater care to limit its operations to military targets and avoid harming civilians and destroying homes. That's the message we give to the Israeli government when we engage with them.
John MacDonald.
The situation in Gaza is having its impact on the West Bank. Tragically, this week, a 14-year-old Israeli child was found dead, and that set off a process of settlers rampaging across the West Bank. We now know that 4 Palestinians have been killed and others brutally attacked. The evidence is that the IDF soldiers stood to one side and allowed that to happen. And meeting with Israeli colleagues this morning, we hear that the Israeli government now is arresting legal and peace observers in the West Bank. Could the government now make it very, very clear to the Israeli government that observers should be allowed to operate within the West Bank to ensure that peace is maintained, but also could we have a report now in detail on the sanctions that the government is applying to Israeli settlements and Israeli settlers?
Minister.
I don't know the detail of some of the earlier points that he'd made. I'll welcome receiving that. But in terms of the sanctions, we put them in place. My understanding and memory is that on 2 individuals, we keep this under review constantly, because those actions and what happens in the settlements are important, and the implications it has for the West Bank.
Laura Hammer.
Thank you very much. The
escalation of recent days has been deeply worrying. We have two nuclear-armed countries exchanging ballistics, and neither with any reputation for care about civilian lives, and both with agendas of their own. That escalation has occupied the headlines, but the people of Gaza continue to suffer unrelenting military attacks and starvation. The rules-based order and international law have suffered lasting damage, including by the targeting of aid workers and medics. The UK's influence with an out-of-control Netanyahu government has yielded very little. One of the few legal tools available is the suspension of arms export licences. When will the government use that?
Minister.
As I said in previous answer, our assessment on export licences remain unchanged. We've got one of the world's most robust export systems in the world, enshrined in law through the Export Control Act and implemented through our strategic export licensing criteria. I think it's really important that she recalls and notes not just the humanitarian situation in Gaza, but also what's happening through Iran's destabilising activities as well.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Humanitarian agencies have concluded that we have passed the point of being able to avert famine in Gaza. Whatever we do now, it will be too late for those people who will have starved to death by the time the aid arrives. That is a stain on the international community. Can the Minister update the House on what specific steps this government has taken to bring about the full implementation of Resolution 2728 passed by the UN Security Council over 3 weeks ago? Pleading, pressuring, pressing the Israeli government clearly is not a strategy that is working. So why doesn't the UK government recognise that consequences and concrete actions can start with the stopping of arms sales to Israel?
Minister.
We are urging, we're pleading, we're doing everything that we can. We're doing everything that we can to make our case. And we're also tripling the amount of aid that we have to 100 million. And, as I said as well, we're taking action to have this life-saving aid corridor by sea to Gaza. These are important actions that we're taking forward.
Colin Lockhart.
Thank you. Having seen the drone attacks on Israel at the weekend, it is disappointing to watch the government and US administration basically telling the Israelis to roll over and accept this aggression by Iran. It was, however, encouraging to see an alliance of air forces assist the Israelis to protect their people. I do wonder why there is little condemnation of this aggression against Israel and continued acknowledgement. Had October the 7th never happened, there would be none of this happening. Therefore, what is this government doing to ensure both Gazans and Israelis are free from Hamas and Iranian aggression respectively and can live normal lives? And as we say in the UK, Israel has the right to defend itself.
Minister.
I agree, the government agrees that Israel does have the right to defend itself, and as part of our approach to finding and putting in place, enabling to put in place a sustainable ceasefire, the role of Hamas has to be put clearly in place. It must not have the influence it has at the moment, and its ability to fire rockets into Israel will need to be completely diminished to enable that sustainable ceasefire to take action.
Stella Creasy.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister will know his words are not cutting through. What Hamas was wrong to reject the ceasefire, but what Israel does next is not inevitable. And yet the Minister for Defence on Monday evening said that they were waiting for aid to be delivered to Rafah and for civilians to leave, and then they would begin the military operation. He will know there is nowhere for these people to go, and there is no food elsewhere. It is an impossible choice for people. A few pita breads will not cut it for millions of people at risk of starvation and at risk of harm from a military operation in Rafah. So what will the UK do if Israel proceeds with its threat to enter Rafah?
Minister.
As the Honourable Member knows, I respect her enormously, and we've worked together on a number of issues. All I would just say on this, vitally important, is that we want to urge restraint about this proposed military operation by the Israelis. We are also calling for restraint in response to what's happened with Iran, although notably the RAF and others were there to provide support to defend Israel from that attack from Iran. So The Foreign Secretary is in Israel, he's in the region this week to tackle these very issues and address the points that I've made.
Marshal Dakota.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On Monday, in response to my question about restoring UNRWA funding, the Prime Minister said that, along with allies, he was reviewing the interim findings. In subsequent responses to other honourable members, he said he was waiting for a final report, now which was due at the end of April. We know that this report is due on the 20th. Can we have a government statement on Monday where the government sets out a clear pathway back to restoring funding? The UK is the only major donor, aside from the United States, that have not restored their funding. Time is running out and lives are being lost.
I recognise the importance of the point she's made, and all I would say, as I said previously, we're waiting for the report and then we will update Parliament on our decision. We need to review this report in detail.
George Galloway.
17 repetitions of "we're waiting for the report" will become the new definition of complacency. The more I listen, Mr. Speaker, to both front benches describing the bloody, putrid sea of misery that is Gaza, the more I was amazed that both of them continue to support the supply of British arms and military components to the country that's doing all this. No one could understand that. And the more he said how hard they were trying, and personally I believe him, seems a sincere chap. But why isn't it working? If you're trying so hard while scrambling your jets to defend Israel, giving arms to Israel, why won't they listen to you?
All I say with respect is that the questions that have been asked to me, I think, are entirely appropriate and understandable given the circumstances. I've responded as best I can from the government's perspective. I think the honourable gentleman knows from his extensive experience that the situation on the ground is hugely complex. We're working night and day. Our officials in FCDO are working flat out. We're providing the support we can for Israel and to help tackle the destabilisation. So I understand the passion that he asked these questions for, but he should also understand these are incredibly complex situations. We're endeavouring to do everything we can with Israel to make our case, but they are also having to think about the implications of what's happening and act after a terrible, tragic attack by Hamas and responses by Iran as well.
Olivia Blake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm concerned to hear from the Minister